Shorebird identification, brought to you by Hillsborough Parks and Recreation and Jackson Bottom Wetlands Preserve. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations. Part of a quote from Henry Beston in The Outermost House. Shorebird migration stopover locations on the Pacific Flyway. This map shows major stopover locations of 100,000 to 1 million shorebirds in spring. Stopover locations, whether large or small, are refueling stations for many species of shorebird that nest in the Arctic. Mid-April to mid-May, broadly speaking, is when shorebirds pass through Oregon. Peak passage is typically early May. Their spring migration is a race from the tropics to the north, with winters the first to stake out territories on the tundra and find mates. An arduous task for which you want to arrive well-fed and rested. Quite the balance to strike, and if you arrive too early, you are greeted by snow and ice. This program features many interpretive signs that are posted at Grays Harbor National Wildlife Refuge in southwest Washington, where over 1 million birds have been counted in a single day during spring migration. Grays Harbor is located right here. The furthest south stopover point is the Tijuana River estuary. The furthest north is the Yukon Delta. Many points in between, especially in Oregon and Washington, there's a number of closely spaced stopover points. Shorebird nesting habitats. Tundra. Tundra describes a plant community devoid of trees due to harsh conditions, primarily where temperatures average 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, or cooler during the growing season. Coastal tundra is found around the northern hemisphere above the Arctic Circle. In this early spring photo, the Alaska oil pipeline crosses the north slope. This is how the nesting territory might look when the birds we see in early May arrive a few weeks later. With ample hours of sunlight, coastal tundra can change from brown to green in a few days, practically as you watch. Most of the sandpipers in the genus Calidrid and 2 of the 3 phalaropes can be found nesting on the coastal plain adjacent to the Beaufort Sea and Arctic Ocean. Western, least, and pectoral sandpipers, as well as red and northern phalaropes, nest upon the green, soggy tundra. Alpine tundra, found at all latitudes. It is a function of altitude and the resulting climatic conditions that occur above tree line. It is nesting habitat for surfbirds and also golden plovers. Rocky shoreline, winter habitat of surfbirds, turnstones, and tattlers. Prairie, nesting habitat of long-billed curlew, upland sandpiper, mountain plover, marbled godwit. Marbled godwit is not pictured. Muskeg, nesting habitat of greater and lesser yellowlegs, solitary sandpiper. The bird in the foreground is a solitary sandpiper, behind is a greater yellowlegs. In Oregon, we observe shorebirds in their northbound and southbound migrations. Many of the spring migrants are in or near full breeding plumage. After a couple thousand more miles, a nightless summer spent raising a family, and then flying back to Oregon and even points south, their feathers are old and worn. They will soon molt into their winter plumage. Shown is breeding plumage above and winter plumage of a western sandpiper. As many as 24 shorebird species, can be found in the greater Grays Harbor estuary. 7 common species are shown. The top photo shows them in breeding plumage. The bottom photo shows them in winter plumage. During spring migration in Oregon, most birds are transitioning into breeding plumage. Many stages can be observed. In the top photo in the center, we have western sandpiper. Going clockwise from there, least sandpiper, dowitcher, red knot, semi-palmated plover, dunlin, and in the upper left, black-bellied plover. Contrast the feather coats they wear in breeding plumage with their winter plumage. In the bottom photo, again beginning in the center, western sandpiper, and going clockwise, least sandpiper, dowitcher, red knot, semi-palmated plover, black-bellied plover, and dunlin. Field marks to pay attention to. Size. Differences in size within a group indicate different species, not different ages. Very small size would relate to our least sandpiper, which by definition and name is our smallest sandpiper or shorebird. Western sandpiper is very close to that, but it transitions up into small, which would be dunlin, medium small, killdeer, medium, a yellow legs, large, illustrated as a godwit, you can tell by the upturned beak here, and very large, black oyster catcher, as identified by the thick, heavy beak, short tail, and rather broad wings. Bill length. Bill length is measured relative to head width, the distance from the base of the bill to the back of the head. That would be here on the very short beak bird, base of the bill to the back of the head is the head width. The beak itself, being very short, is shorter than that distance. In a short beak, the distances are very much equal. The beak is about as long as the head is wide. With medium length bills, the bill starts to exceed the width of the head. And then so on up to long and very long. The shape and size of the bill and leg length determine where and how each species forages. Many birds in a small area will separate out to hunt their prey, thus avoiding competition amongst birds. Bill length. It's not all in the name. Female shorebirds in general are larger than males. When it comes to the two dowitcher species, the names can be confusing. A female short-billed dowitcher, right, may have a longer bill than a male long-billed dowitcher below. Body color. The importance of color tone is showed in comparing the whimbrel and long-billed curlew. With a close look, several distinctions are obvious, but the cool brown-gray of the whimbrel versus the rich warm brown of the curlew is an overall quality of the bird's appearance that is easy to notice from afar. Leg color. Least sandpiper, western sandpiper. These two are among the most abundant species during spring and fall migrations. Learn these well and you will know when you are looking at something that is not one of them. Then get out your field guide. To distinguish these two, focusing on leg color is a very good field mark to use. Foraging behavior. Plover versus sandpiper. In the top row we see a plover moving left to right. It is standing tall, it runs, it pecks at the ground, it stands tall again, and repeats this behavior over and over. They sight their prey visually, and their prey is always on the surface. They are not able to probe deeply into the sand with their short beak. Sandpipers, on the other hand, have longer beaks and tend to feed by feeling for their prey with their beaks. And they move along with their beak almost constantly in the sand, as though they're stitching it together. The plovers have very short or short bills, never longer than from base of bill to back of the head. A semi-palmated plover is shown. Sandpipers have medium to long bills. A dunlin in winter plumage is shown. Bird topography. Learn what parts are where. These maps are in every field guide. Practice using a couple of topographical terms each time you go out birding. You might begin with the mantle, the shoulder area just behind the head, the scapulars, which are the flight feathers that cover where the wing joins the body, the lower back as opposed to the rump and the upper tail coverts and the tail. In the wings, we have coverts that cover the wings like shingles, and when the tips of coverts are patterned differently, it will result in prominent markings, which we'll look at in the next slide. Practice a few terms, learn to apply them to a bird in flight as well as a bird at rest. Wing pattern. In flight, notice if the wing has a stripe or no stripe. Spotted sandpiper is a good example of a local breeding shorebird with a conspicuous wing stripe visible only in flight. Train yourself to look at the wing when the birds fly by and note whether it's plain or vivid or anything in between. These are illustrations of the rump of a bird. And when you look at the back end of a bird, it's important to be aware that you're looking at the wing feathers is the upper projection of the back end of the body, and below that you'll see the tail feathers projecting out. At rest, the wing feathers are above the tail. Primary projection refers to relative lengths of individual primary wing feathers. Here we see 2, here we see 1, 2, 3, 4 individual primary feathers. It can be difficult to parse out in the field, but it's still good to look for. It requires close attention to bird topography and benefits from good optics and practice. Good luck. Shorebird bills are cool. Different beak lengths determine the different levels birds feed at in the mud. Many different types of birds can forage in the same area because they are feeding in different places in the mud. Shorebirds can be identified by where they forage on the mud flat and the feeding methods they use. Can you see different feeding strategies among the shorebirds? Shorebirds have sensors on the ends of their beaks to detect movement. The birds are eating tiny clams, worms, sand fleas, small invertebrates, mollusks, and crustaceans. Bill flexibility. We think of bills as hard, inflexible, and unfeeling, but the sandpiper family is different. The bill is an incredibly flexible, tactile, and sensitive tool, and could perhaps be thought of in the same manner as an elephant's trunk. These birds locate their prey in mud by feeling it in substrate with tiny receptors at the end of their incredibly flexible, tactile, and sensitive bill. Researchers know it is important to avoid contact with the sensitive bill in order to do no harm. Bills of tactile foragers. Some shorebirds feel for their prey. They have evolved bone that has thousands of pits that support special sensory organs, Herbst corpuscles. The thin keratin layer of skin covering the bill is also covered with an extraordinary amount of nerve endings that allows effective proprioception, ability to feel pressure gradients. They use the sensitivity of their bills to differentiate currents in the water, in wet sand or mud, and differences between individual grains, stones, or shells. Tactile shorebirds use a Doppler radar method with their bill in the mud. The rapid probing tends to liquefy the mud to detect objects of various densities and size. Overall, some shorebirds rely upon tactile stimulation in their bills to forage effectively and survive. This includes all birds that probe, such as western and least sandpipers, dunlin, dowitchers, red knots, whimbrels, godwits, yellowlegs, etc. In the photographs, we have the tip of a shorebird's bill here, and then a very enlarged photograph there showing how this is the bone of the bill, and the bone has got thousands of pits in it. We are not seeing the keratin layer of skin, the sheath over the bill that a live bird would have. We're looking at what's below that. What are shorebirds eating? They're eating marvelous mudflat meals. Starting from the right, we have heart cockle, horse clam, little neck clam, softshell clam, ghost shrimp, bent nose clam, corophium, the Macoma clam, proboscis worm, thread worm, lugworm, also known as the innkeeper worm because so many other organisms live in its nice U-shaped tunnel there. We have a bamboo worm and a spinoid worm. They look pretty delicious. Biofilm is shorebird food. What is biofilm? A layer of microbes, diatoms and bacteria, their extracellular mucus substances, snot, detritus, and sediment. It grows dense enough to form a thin layer on the surface of the mud that holds together and can be slurped up. A study discovered that many shorebird species consume surficial intertidal biofilm, an unsuspected food source. Biofilm feeding is widespread and composes up to 70% of a small shorebird's diet, dunlin, western and least sandpipers, etc. Biofilm feeding birds have developed brush-like spines on the tip of their tongues, which are used to scrape biofilm up from surficial sediments. Tongue spines are more developed in smaller birds and long-distant migrants. Take a look at the electron microscope image of a sandpiper tongue. Small-bodied shorebirds, specifically, have difficulty eating larger and dense prey because of small digestive organ size. They cannot get to prey hidden deeply in sediments with their short bills. They evolved their unique tongue, narrow tubular bills, and foraging behavior to exploit smaller and softer foods such as biofilm. Consuming biofilm. Time-lapse photographs across the top shows this mud that is sort of the waste product after it's already scraped off the good stuff. It keeps eating that and the mud just keeps coming in and dribbling out. It looks like its tongue is active there. Here we see it where there's a drip-like structure at the tip of the bill, indicating that very soft, filmy material. Migration research at Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay. Research involves long-term work, not a snapshot. Birds were netted and tagged at wintering and migratory sites. Each bird received a Fish and Wildlife Service band, colored bands, and a traditional tiny telemetry transmitter. Very small satellite transmitters were not available. Researchers stationed in California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska tracked the birds' movements along the flyway. Radio antennas and telemetry receivers were used on the ground and by plane. 2002 research results. Migration stopover time. Time spent eating and resting. Western sandpipers stayed 5 days at San Francisco. They stayed 2 days at Grays Harbor and 2 days at Willapa Bay. Dunlin stayed 6 days at Grays Harbor, 4 days at Willapa Bay. Dowitchers stayed 4 days at Grays Harbor, 6 days at Willapa Bay. Then they continued on their long journey to Alaska to breed. In 2004, Western sandpipers stayed 7 days at San Francisco, 2 to 3 days at Grays Harbor, and 2 to 3 days at Willapa Bay. Flight time from San Francisco Bay to Copper River Delta in 2002 took 10 days for males and females. In 2004, took only 4 days for females and took only 5 days for males. That's flight time. Wow, note the difference in how long it took for birds to get to Alaska to breed in the 2 years of study. Where are the shorebirds? Typically, shorebirds migrating north in the spring would be visible in Grays Harbor National Wildlife Refuge in fairly large numbers between late April and very early May. The first birds arrive around the 3rd week of April and the last leave around the middle of May. However, wildlife populations do not run on our clocks. They have their own way of determining when it is time to migrate, so there is no way of knowing the exact day of the first arriving birds. Also, there is no way to know when the peak number of birds will be here. Ideally, the best time to see shorebirds foraging on the mudflat is about 2.5 to 3 hours before through 2 hours after high tide. There are many factors that drive shorebird behavior. If the birds are not here, there are several possible reasons why. Why can't I see any shorebirds? The tidewater may be totally covering the mudflats, preventing shorebird use. Most shorebirds have short legs and need to have very, very shallow water or exposed mud to find invertebrates buried in mud. Low pressure systems cause higher surface water conditions. Onshore winds push water into the basin and can inundate the mudflat. Most shorebirds can't forage in water. Heavy winds or heavy rain prevent shorebirds from maneuvering quickly to avoid predators. The birds may have taken cover in salt marsh vegetation. Heavy rains in previous days cause rivers to rapidly drain into the estuary. This raises the water to cover what would be a mudflat. These conditions often cause surface water to be above posted tide levels. Birds may have good tailwinds pushing them north. They may not need to stop here. They may continue up to Fraser River Delta in British Columbia, or Stikine Estuary, or to Juneau Wetlands in Alaska. Birds may have difficult headwinds that force them out of the sky south of Grays Harbor Estuary. Maybe they are at Willapa Bay or the Columbia River Estuary. When they get refueled, they most likely bypass the refuge on their way north. Why can't I see any shorebirds? Part 2. There are over 90 square miles of mudflats, marsh, and open water in the greater Grays Harbor Estuary. Shorebirds tend to spread out over the entire estuary. This is especially true during low tide. Shorebirds are small, brownish-colored birds and can be hard to see at a distance. They may be at the far end of the basin. Because they are small, it is hard to tell how many there are. An avian predator such as a peregrine falcon, merlin, or bald eagle may have scared them away. Shorebirds are an important diet component for these predators. Shorebirds may return shortly. Watch for the predator to fly by. The shorebirds often fly to the island visible from the end of the Sandpiper boardwalk. On the lower picture, the caption says, "Shorebirds are flying away with a falcon chasing them." And what is hard to see here, but these dense clouds there and there are swarms, or it's a defensive behavior that the shorebirds en masse perform as a defense against attack by a falcon, in particular peregrines and merlins. And it's as though the birds get up into the air and every bird tries to be in the center as much as possible. And if it's low to the ground like we see over here, then it'll form a dome. But that whole mass of birds may also rise into the sky and become just an orb or a sphere of birds, all trying to get into the center. And the falcon's job is to get above them, dive through them, so they have to split in half and try to grab one of the indecisive birds. The Big Eight includes common and not so common species: western sandpiper, long-billed dowitcher, short-billed dowitcher, red knot, least sandpiper, dunlin, black-bellied plover, and semi-palmated plover. Amongst those, the red knot is the one I would say that is not so common. It tends to come by later in migration and in very small numbers here on the west coast. Western sandpiper. The western sandpiper is slightly larger than the smallest of the sandpipers, the least sandpiper. If they were side by side, it would be noticeable. When they're not side by side, it's a little harder to tell. Some of the field marks to look for on a western sandpiper include black legs, an all black bill that's thick at the base. Often will show a little bit of a droop, as you see down here in our winter plumage bird towards the tip, and the tip is slightly bulbous. You can look for rusty colors in the crown that you see here, and also in the scapulars. And then in breeding plumage, these triangular black marks that begin on the upper breast and become less and less noticeable as you progress along the flanks towards the tail. These are all good field marks. In winter plumage, you're missing some of those field marks. However, the beak and the legs are still the same. The overall color of the body is a cold gray compared to a warm brown of a least sandpiper in winter plumage. Least sandpiper, the smallest of the sandpipers. Least sandpipers have yellow legs. Their beak is not as large as a western sandpiper's beak. It almost always shows a slight D curve to the bill. It will also have rusty colors in the crown and in the scapulars. Least sandpipers often feed at the highest point of the mudflats, often right into the salt marsh vegetation that crowds the edge of the mudflat. Long-billed dowitcher and short-billed dowitchers. Dowitchers are distinctive because of their bill length. Regardless of species, the beak is prominent. Easy to notice. It's a long bill, it's straight, it's black, and body color can change dramatically between the breeding plumage birds we see up on top versus the winter plumage bird. In order to differentiate long-billed from short-billed, it takes a lot of practice, and you can't always be sure, but if you work at it, you can get better. A field mark that is not shown here or in the next slide with the short-billed dowitcher is one that is prominent in flight. you'll have to check your field guide for this, but on the upper or lower back rather, in this area right here, in flight, you'll see a prominent white triangle extending from the rump area up towards the mantle. And that's something that you will identify them as dowitchers, which is a very good place to get to in shorebird identification. If you'd like to become an expert at telling the two apart, I'm going to leave that up to you. There's lots of references and resources out there for you. Red knot. They arrive in small numbers late in spring migration. You can see from their breeding map that they are a very northern breeding shorebird, and all of the yellow you see here along the coastlines are when you would see them in migration as they're heading towards this area. The yellow begins so far north on the continent because they are flying over the ocean from their wintering grounds and make landfall as you get above 45 degrees latitude. And then they keep going up to the north. Very striking bird in breeding plumage, very stout black bill of medium to medium long length. The red color shows up very nicely against the gray, and then in winter plumage, like so many of the shorebirds, they look quite different. Dunlin. Dunlin in breeding plumage are very distinctive because of the black belly spot. I mentioned that spring migrants coming through Oregon are often in different stages of plumage. They're molting from their winter plumage into breeding plumage as they move north. When you're looking at Dunlin, you might try to see how many of the birds have a full black belly breeding patch and how many just have some black spots starting to show. Also look for the rusty coloring along the scapulars as well. The beak is similar to a western sandpiper, but it is even longer and it is slightly decurved. And in winter plumage is where their name Dunlin comes from. Dun meaning dun colored or plain brown, colored of the marsh. Black belly plover. In breeding plumage, very striking, with a much broader black belly patch than the one we just looked at with the Dunlin, and also dark face and dark upper breast, and then black and white speckling throughout the body like this. Once again, winter plumage, not nearly so dramatic. Learn the calls of the black belly plover. They have a very plaintive whistle note that you will hear when they're in the area, and it's a good indicator that you should be looking for black belly plovers out there. Semi-palmated plover. Semi-palmated refers to web-like tissue between the toes, something you can't see here. And they have webbing between their outer toe and middle toe, and that's where the name semi-palmated plover comes from. They are distinctive in that they have a single black band around the neck. Killdeer, also a plover, have two black bands around the neck and are significantly larger than a semi-palmated plover as well. Notice the bicolored beak, orange at the base and black at the tip, and the white forehead right here, and then the black mark on top of the head that extends down and around the eye like a mask, and yellow legs. Well, we hope you've enjoyed the shorebird presentation. I encourage you to get out into the field and see what you can find. And in the meantime, the end.